She stood shivering in the quiet lantern light, her trembling fingers clutching the heavy cotton of her dress against her chest. When the fabric slicked harsh purple and yellow bruises painting her pale ribs were exposed, the rugged rancher froze, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. "Who hurt you?" The year was 1883, and the Idaho Territory was a harsh, unforgiving expanse of sagebrush and jagged mountains. For Wyatt Sterling, a 32-year-old rancher who had carved a successful cattle operation out of the rocky soil of Owyhee County, the isolation was a double-edged sword. It kept the noise of the world away, but the quiet of his sprawling homestead, the Iron Creek Ranch, had become a deafening echo. Wyatt wasn't a man of many words, but he was a man who craved partnership. That was what had driven him to the matrimonial news, and ultimately to the Nampa train depot on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. He stood on the wooden platform, the dust of the trail still clinging to his boots and his Stetson pulled low against the glaring sun. In his calloused hand, he held a single dog-eared letter. It was written in elegant, though slightly hurried penmanship. Vivian Higgins, that was her name. Her letters had been polite, practical, and devoid of the romantic fluff that other women had written him. She asked about the winters, the safety of the territory, and if he was a man who drank heavily. Wyatt had answered honestly. The winters were brutal, the territory was wild, and he only drank whiskey on Christmas and Independence Day. That had apparently been enough for her. The shrill whistle of the Union Pacific pierced the dry air. Wyatt straightened his posture as the massive iron beast hissed and groaned to a halt, billowing white steam across the platform. Passengers began to disembark, mostly miners, traveling salesmen, and soldiers. And then he saw her. Vivian stepped down from the passenger car, clutching a worn leather valise. She was younger than he expected, perhaps no more than 24, with strands of auburn hair escaping a modest, ash-colored traveling hat. But it wasn't her youth that struck Wyatt. It was the sheer exhaustion etched into her delicate features. She looked like a bird that had flown through a hurricane. Her eyes, a striking shade of hazel, darted around the platform with a hyper-vigilance that set Wyatt's instincts on edge. She wasn't just looking for him, she was looking over her shoulder. Wyatt stepped forward, removing his hat. "Miss Higgins." Vivian jumped, a startled gasp escaping her lips before she gathered her composure. She looked up at the towering, broad-shouldered rancher, taking in his weathered face and steady, pale blue eyes. "Mr. Sterling," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. I am here." "I see that," Wyatt said gently, reaching out to take her heavy valise. He noticed how she instinctively flinched when his hand moved toward her, drawing her own arms tight against her body. A subtle frown creased his brow, but he said nothing. "My wagon is just out back. It's a long ride to Iron Creek." The journey to the ranch was mostly silent. The rhythmic clopping of the draft horses and the squeak of the wagon wheels filled the void. Wyatt observed her out of the corner of his eye. She sat rigidly upright on the wooden bench, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were entirely white. Every sudden jolt of the wagon, every cry of a distant hawk made her tense. Wyatt was a man who understood frightened animals. He knew when a creature had been beaten. The realization that this woman sitting beside him carried some unseen terror settled heavily in his gut. They didn't wait to get to the ranch to make it official. They stopped at the small, dusty parish in Silver City, where Reverend Miller, a tired-looking man with spectacles resting on the tip of his nose, was waiting. The ceremony was brief, devoid of flowers, music, or celebration. When Wyatt slid the simple gold band onto Vivian's finger, he felt the icy chill of her skin. "I pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Miller said, closing his Bible. "May God grant you peace in this wild country." Peace, Wyatt thought, as he helped his new bride back into the wagon. It was the one thing Vivian looked like she had never known. They arrived at Iron Creek Ranch just as the sun was dipping below the Owyhee Mountains, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. The house was a sturdy two-story cabin made of thick pine logs, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. It was clean, but undeniably a bachelor's domain. "It ain't a mansion, Vivian," Wyatt said, carrying her bag into the parlor. "But the roof don't leak, and the stove runs hot." "It's beautiful," she whispered, and for the first time Wyatt thought he heard a sliver of genuine relief in her voice. She looked at the heavy wooden door, the thick iron latch, and the vast emptiness outside the windows. "It's far away from everything." "That it is," Wyatt agreed, striking a match to light the oil lamp on the table. "You're safe here, Vivian. I don't know what you left behind in the East, and I won't pry until you're ready to tell me. But out here, my word is law, and my word is that no harm will come to you under this roof." Vivian looked at him, her hazel eyes welling with unshed tears. She gave a small, jerky nod. But as the evening wore on, the nervous energy radiating from her only intensified. The reality of the mail-order contract was looming. She was a wife now, alone in the cabin with a massive, formidable stranger. Dinner was a quiet affair of stew and sourdough biscuits that Wyatt had prepared earlier that morning. Vivian barely ate, simply moving the food around her tin plate. Wyatt didn't push her. When the grandfather clock in the corner struck 9, the heavy silence in the room seemed to vibrate. "It's been a long journey for you," Wyatt said, standing up and clearing the plates. "The bedroom is at the top of the stairs, first door on the right. There's fresh water in the pitcher. I have some ledgers to balance down here. I'll be a while." He was offering her a reprieve, a chance to compose herself and prepare for bed without him hovering. Vivian understood the grace in his gesture. "Thank you, Wyatt," she murmured, picking up her valise and making her way up the narrow wooden stairs. Wyatt sat at the heavy oak table, staring unseeingly at his ranch ledgers. He was a patient man, but he was also protective. The way she had flinched at the train station was burned into his mind. He waited a full hour, listening to the soft, hesitant footsteps above him. Finally, when the house was completely silent save for the crackling of the dying fire, he slowly made his way upstairs. He opened the bedroom door quietly, not wanting to startle her. The room was illuminated by a single low-burning lamp on the washstand. Vivian wasn't in bed. She was standing by the wash basin, her back to the door, trying to unlace the tight, restrictive corset of her traveling dress. Her hands were shaking violently, and she was struggling with the knots. "Vivian," Wyatt said softly, stepping into the room. "Do you need some help with?" Startled by his voice, Vivian gasped and spun around. In her panic, she tripped over the hem of her heavy skirt. She grabbed the edge of the washstand to steady herself, but the sudden movement caused the already loosened bodice of her dress to slip off her shoulders, taking her sheer white camise down with it. Wyatt rushed forward to catch her, but he stopped dead in his tracks. The breath was punched out of his lungs. He wasn't looking at the soft, unblemished skin of a new bride. He was looking at a canvas of brutality, spanning her ribs, creeping up to her collarbone, and wrapping around her sides were horrific, mottled bruises. Some were fading to a sickly yellow and green, but others, particularly a vicious hand-shaped cluster on her left rib cage, were a fresh, angry purple. There were older, thin silver scars crisscrossing her shoulder blades. It was the undeniable geography of systemic, merciless violence. Vivian let out a choked sob, desperately pulling the fabric back up to cover herself, shrinking away from him until her back hit the log wall. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the anger, waiting for the disgust, waiting for the strike. Wyatt didn't move. His jaw locked, the muscles in his neck standing out like steel cables. The quiet, stoic rancher felt a wave of cold, murderous rage wash over him, unlike anything he had ever experienced in his life. He slowly lowered his hands, keeping them entirely visible and open, treating her like a wild mustang cornered in a canyon. "Vivian." His voice was a dangerous, gravelly whisper that seemed to shake the floorboards. "Who hurt you?" She shook her head rapidly, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. Please, she begged, her voice cracking. Please don't send me back. I'll work. I'll clean. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't send me back to him. Come back. Thou. Wyatt took one slow, deliberate step backward, giving her space. I ain't sending you anywhere, but you need to tell me whose hands did this to you. Vivian slid down the wall, pulling her knees to her chest, her defenses finally shattering. His name is Thomas, she choked out, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Thomas Arrington. Wyatt recognized the name. Anyone who read the regional papers knew it. Thomas Arrington wasn't just a man. He was a ruthless railway baron operating out of Chicago, a man whose wealth bought judges, sheriffs, and politicians. He was my brother-in-law, Vivian continued, her voice barely a whisper. When my sister died of the fever, Thomas claimed I owed him the debts my father left behind. He took our estate. He took everything. He kept me locked in the east wing of the house. He said I belonged to him now, that I was to replace my sister. My sister? She squeezed her eyes shut, the memory bringing a fresh wave of agony. When I refused to marry him, he beat me. When I tried to escape the first time, he used his riding crop. He told me if I ever ran again, he wouldn't just kill me, he would torture me until I begged for death. Wyatt's fists clenched at his sides, his nails biting into his palms. How did you get away? A maid, Vivian sobbed. A kind girl named Sarah. She smuggled me out in a laundry cart, gave me her meager savings, and told me to run as far west as the trains would go. I saw your advertisement in a paper left behind at the station. I used a fake name. Higgins was my mother's maiden name. I thought if I belonged to another man legally, Thomas couldn't touch me. She looked up at him, her face completely, entirely raw and terrified. I lied to you, Wyatt. I brought danger to your door. I'm so sorry. Wyatt stared at the broken woman on his floor. He didn't see a liar. He saw a survivor of unimaginable grit. He walked over to the heavy oak wardrobe, pulled out a thick woolen blanket, and gently draped it over her trembling shoulders. You didn't bring danger to my door, Vivian, Wyatt said, his voice terrifyingly calm. You brought a dead man walking. He knelt down so he was eye-level with her. You are Vivian Sterling now. This is my land, and you are my wife. Thomas Arrington's money means nothing out here in the Howey dirt. If he comes for you, I swear to Almighty God I will bury him so deep the devil himself won't find him. That night, Wyatt didn't share the bed. He took his Winchester rifle, pulled a chair to the top of the stairs, and sat in the dark, standing guard over his sleeping bride. For the first time in months, Vivian slept without waking up screaming. But the vast distances of the West were shrinking, and a man with Thomas Arrington's money had a long reach. The next morning, Wyatt hitched the wagon to ride into Silver City for a month's worth of supplies, leaving Vivian locked safely inside the cabin with a loaded Colt revolver and strict instructions not to open the door for anyone. When Wyatt arrived in town, the usual hustle of the mining camp felt different. He walked into the general store, grabbing a sack of flour and coffee beans. As he turned to pay the clerk, his eyes caught the wall next to the local sheriff's office through the front window. A man in a tailored Eastern-style suit was nailing up a fresh piece of paper. Wyatt walked out onto the boardwalk, his boots thudding heavily against the wood. He approached the wall and stared at the bold black ink. It was a wanted poster, but it wasn't for Thomas Arrington. It featured a startlingly accurate sketch of Vivian. Wanted for grand larceny and attempted murder. Vivian Montgomery, $5,000 reward. Thomas Arrington hadn't just sent men to look for a runaway bride. He had legally branded her a dangerous fugitive, turning every bounty hunter, lawman, and desperate citizen in the West into a bloodhound hunting Wyatt's wife. The real war hadn't even begun. Wyatt tore the heavy parchment from the wall, his jaw set so tightly that his teeth ground together. A $5,000 bounty was enough to turn every desperate drifter, corrupt lawman, and seasoned killer in the Idaho Territory into a bloodhound. Thomas Arrington wasn't just trying to drag his runaway bride back to Chicago. He was ensuring that if she couldn't be captured, she would be slaughtered. Wyatt didn't bother buying the rest of his supplies. He threw the sack of flour into the back of his wagon, unhitched the horses with frantic precision, and drove the teen back toward Iron Creek Ranch at a breakneck pace. The wagon wheels kicked up a massive cloud of alkaline dust, mirroring the storm brewing in his chest. When he burst through the heavy oak door of the cabin, Vivian was by the stove, her sleeves rolled up, scrubbing a cast-iron skillet. She took one look at Wyatt's pale, sweat-streaked face, and the crumpled wanted poster in his fist, and the skillet slipped from her hands, clattering loudly against the floorboards. Wyatt smoothed the poster out on the table. Vivian stared at her own sketched face, the blood draining completely from her cheeks. "Attempted murder," Wyatt said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Grand larceny. He's put a price on your head that would buy half of Auhie County. Vivian, I need the absolute truth right now. A man like Arrington doesn't offer $5,000 just for a bruised woman who ran away. Pride costs money, but it doesn't cost that much. What did you take from him?" Vivian trembled, her hazel eyes darting to the floor. For a long moment the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock. Then, without a word, she walked over to her worn leather valise sitting by the stairs. She knelt, her fingers working at the inner lining until a sharp ripping sound echoed through the room. From a hidden false bottom she extracted a thick, leather-bound book with a brass lock. "I told you he claimed our estate when my sister died to settle my father's debts," Vivian whispered, bringing the book to the table. "But I found this in his study the night Sarah smuggled me out. My father didn't owe him anything. Thomas orchestrated the bankruptcy. But it's worse than that, Wyatt. Thomas is funding a massive illegal land grab for the Union Pacific. He's been bribing federal judges and territorial politicians." She tapped the cover of the book. "There are ledgers in here documenting cash payments to Governor John N. Erwin and half the territorial legislature. If this book reaches a federal marshal, Thomas Arrington will hang for treason and extortion." Wyatt stared at the ledger, a slow, grim understanding washing over him. Vivian wasn't just a victim. She was a witness, carrying the keys to an empire's destruction. "He framed me for stealing jewelry and stabbing his guard to justify the bounty," Vivian said, tears finally welling. "If they catch me, they won't bring me to trial. They'll shoot me in the desert and take the book." "They ain't catching you," Wyatt said, pulling his Winchester repeating rifle from the mantel. He tossed her the loaded Colt revolver. "Do you know how to fire that?" Vivian caught the heavy iron, her hands shaking, but she nodded. "My father taught me before he passed." "Good. Keep it cocked and stay away from the windows." The attack didn't come that day, nor the next. It came on the fourth morning, just as the pale gray light of dawn crept over the jagged peaks of the Auhie Mountains. Wyatt was awake, nursing a cup of black coffee by the unlit hearth, when the unnatural silence of the ranch alerted him. The meadowlarks had stopped singing. The draft horses in the corral were stamping nervously. Wyatt peered through a crack in the heavy wooden shutters. Through the morning mist, 3 figures were advancing on foot, their horses tied off in the distant tree line. They were hardened men wearing long dusters, armed with Sharps rifles and scatterguns. Leading them was a notorious local tracker named Deacon Cobb, a man who would shoot his own mother for $100 gold piece. "Vivian," Wyatt barked softly. "Get behind the stove." The heavy thud of the boot hitting the front porch broke the morning quiet. Wyatt Sterling, Deacon Cobb's raspy voice called out. "We know you got the Montgomery girl in there. Send her out, and we ride away peaceful. You don't want to die for a Chicago thief." Wyatt didn't answer with words. He kicked the front door open just enough to rest the barrel of his Winchester on the jamb and fired. The bullet splintered the porch post an inch from Cobb's ear. Hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from the yard, shattering the parlor windows and sending shards of glass flying across the room. Lead bit into the thick pine logs of the cabin, filling the air with wood splinters and the acrid stench of black powder. Wyatt fired methodically, working the lever of his rifle with practiced, lethal speed. He clipped one of the bounty hunters in the shoulder, sending the man sprawling into the dirt with a howl of pain. But there were 3 of them, and Wyatt couldn't cover every angle. While Cobb and the wounded man laid down suppressive fire on the front door, the 3rd hunter slipped around to the back of the cabin. Wyatt heard the sickening crunch at the kitchen window giving way. "Vivian, the back," he yelled over the deafening roar of gunfire. The bounty hunter, a massive man with a scarred face, threw his leg over the windowsill, leveling a revolver right at Wyatt's exposed back. A deafening boom echoed from the kitchen. The hunter froze, a look of profound shock washing over his scarred face. He dropped his gun and collapsed backward into the dirt. Vivian stood by the iron stove, the Colt revolver trembling violently in her hands, a plume of white smoke rising from the barrel. She hadn't hesitated. Outside, seeing his men fall, Deacon Cobb realized the $5,000 bounty wasn't worth a pine box. He scrambled backward into the sagebrush, wildly firing 2 blind shots before turning and running for the tree line. Wyatt didn't give chase. He immediately dropped his rifle and ran to Vivian. She had dropped the Colt and was violently shaking, her breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. "I killed him," she sobbed, staring at her hands. "Wyatt, I killed a man." Wyatt pulled her into his chest, wrapping his massive arms tightly around her trembling frame. "You saved my life, Vivian. You saved our home." He was a trespasser with murder in his heart. "You did what the frontier demands." He held her until her breathing steadied, the smell of gunpowder clinging to them both. But as he looked out the shattered window at the retreating dust cloud of Deacon Cobb, Wyatt knew the war was far from over. Cobb would run straight to the telegraph office. He would tell Arrington exactly where the girl with the black ledger was hiding. It took exactly 8 days for the devil to arrive. He didn't come sneaking through the brush like a bounty hunter. Thomas Arrington arrived in a chartered wagon flanked by 6 heavily armed Pinkerton agents. Arrington was a tall, imposing man, wearing an immaculate 3-piece wool suit that looked entirely absurd against the rugged backdrop of the Idaho high desert. His face was sharp, aristocratic, and twisted with an arrogant sneer. Wyatt stood on his front porch, his Winchester resting casually against his hip. Behind him, the cabin door was closed. "Mr. Sterling, I presume," Arrington called out, stepping down from the wagon. He didn't bother drawing a weapon. He let his hired guns handle the intimidation. "I have come for my property. You've harbored a dangerous fugitive. Hand her over, and I'll see to it the territorial marshal doesn't hang you for aiding and abetting." Wyatt spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dusty ground. "My wife ain't property, Arrington. And the only fugitive on this ranch is standing in a 3-piece suit." Arrington's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine rage cracking his polished exterior. "You ignorant dirt farmer, you have no idea who you are dealing with. I own the railroads, I own the banks, I own the men who wear the tin stars in this territory. Break down the door," he ordered his Pinkertons. The 6 men stepped forward, leveling their rifles. "I wouldn't do that," a booming voice echoed from the ridge above the cabin. Arrington whipped his head around. Lining the rocky ridge overlooking the branch were 10 men on horseback, their silhouettes cutting a hard line against the afternoon sun. Leading them was a man with a thick mustache and a deaning silver star pinned to his canvas coat. It was United States Marshal Fred Dubois, one of the few federal men in the territory who couldn't be bought by railroad money. Wyatt hadn't just waited around after the first attack. He had ridden into Silver City and sent a telegram directly to Dubois in Boise, outlining the contents of the Black Ledger and offering the ultimate prize, the man pulling the corrupt strings of the territory. "Marshal Dubois," Arrington said, his voice faltering slightly as he tried to maintain his composure. "This is a misunderstanding. This man is harboring a thief. The only thief I see is the one who stole federal land grants, Mr. Arrington," Dubois yelled down, spurring his horse down the ridge, his deputies following closely behind with their rifles drawn. "Mr. Sterling here sent me a wire about a certain black ledger." The cabin door opened. Vivian stepped out onto the porch. She didn't look like the terrified, bruised bird that had stepped off the train weeks ago. She stood tall, her chin held high, the black leather book clutched firmly in her hands. She locked eyes with her former tormentor, and for the first time in her life, she watched Thomas Arrington pale with absolute terror. "You have no proof," Arrington shouted, stepping back as Dubois and his men surrounded him. "That book is a forgery. We'll let a federal judge in Washington decide that," Dubois said grimly. "A judge you haven't paid off. Thomas Arrington, you are under arrest for extortion, bribery of public officials, and federal treason. Disarm these men." The Pinkertons, seeing they were outgunned by federal lawmen, wisely dropped their rifles into the dust. Arrington screamed and cursed, his aristocratic facade shattering as heavy iron cuffs were slapped onto his wrists. Vivian watched without a flinch as the man who had beaten her, starved her, and hunted her was thrown roughly into the back of a prison wagon, entirely stripped of his power. When the dust of the departing lawman finally settled, leaving the Iron Creek Ranch in deep, profound silence, Wyatt turned to his wife. The heavy weight of the past month seemed to lift from her shoulders all at once. She looked at Wyatt, this stoic, rugged man who had asked for a mail-order bride to cook his meals, but had instead waged a war against an empire just to keep her safe. Wyatt reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a stray lock of auburn hair from her cheek. The terrible bruises that had once painted her skin had faded to nothing but a memory. "The winter is coming soon," Wyatt said softly, his pale blue eyes searching hers. "It gets mighty cold up here in the Oahes. You still want to stay?" Vivian placed her hand over his, leaning into his touch. "Wyatt," she smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that lit up the desolate landscape. "I'm already home. If this tale of frontier justice, survival, and Wild West romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling, true-to-life historical story. Let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Wyatt's boots?